In this video, I'm going to show you some of the camera settings that I use when I photograph wildlife. Hey guys, I hope you're all doing well. In my last video, I showed you some of the basic setup that I use in my cameras when I photograph wildlife. And I hope what you got out of that video was that I really don't have a very complicated setup. And for the most part, I do a lot of things manually. I don't really trust a lot of the automatic features of the cameras. I'm happy for them to make suggestions, but for the most part, I won't give over full control to the cameras. In this video, I want to show you a few of the settings that I use that are important to me. I'm not going to show you every single setting that I use, and I'm not going to provide a downloadable configuration. It's not that I am not willing to do that, it's just that my settings are actually quite simple, and that's what I hope that you get out of this video, is that I don't really have any magic settings at all. I have a pretty straightforward setup, although the things that I will show you are pretty important to me, and anything I show you, you can easily set up on your own cameras. And as with the last video, although I'm showing you how I've got things set up on my Sony cameras, pretty much everything applies to any other camera system as well. Now, in the last video, I talked about exposure and focus, and we'll do the same thing here as well. So, one of the things, of course, that's fairly important for me in order to help me quickly assess my exposure is the histogram. So I always have the histogram there. The other thing that's fairly important is that I use spot metering. And more importantly, I have the spot metering set up so that the area that is being metered is actually linked to the focus area so that it moves around with the focus area. So you'll see that as I move this focus area, which is the red square around here, you'll see inside the red square there is a black circle. And that is the area that the camera is using to evaluate the exposure. And if I change the size of the focus area, and it's currently large, if I change it to small, you'll see that the red square is much smaller now, but the black circle is the same size, and it's actually outside the red square now. Now, as I move that area around, you'll see how quite dramatically in this particular case the exposure is changing, and that's because in this particular case the area that the camera is assessing is an area that has both some dark, which is brown in this case, and as well as light or white parts as well. And so depending on exactly where the area is, it's going to affect that exposure quite dramatically. The bottom line is that I really am only using the histogram and the assessment of the exposure via the spot metering as a guide. What I really am using most of all is the highlight warnings, or the blinkies, or the zebras. So when I raise my exposure here, you'll see that I get those highlight warnings on the chest of the fox telling me that I'm probably losing some detail there. And I say probably because these things are not exact. This is based off the JPEG preview in the camera, and that's not the file that I'll be editing. I'll be editing the raw file. And it also depends on what my setting is for those the threshold at which those highlight warnings come on. And in my case, I have it set to 100 plus, and I know people will use other people will use different settings. So the most important thing to me, though, is that two things. One is that I am focusing, possibly the wrong word, but I'm prioritizing the exposure of the subject within the frame, and then also on the subject I'm prioritizing the area that I'm focusing on, which will generally be the head or eyes of the animal, and also I really do not want to clip my highlights and lose any detail there, unless of course I'm trying to do something exceptional such as shooting a high key image where I will be embracing the whites and the highlights, and the camera will be screaming at me with highlight warnings everywhere. And that's an example of the fact that every situation is different, and it's really up to you to decide what you want. You can only, all of these things that I'm showing you are only things that are being used as a guide to help you assess the exposure and make your decisions. And you also have to practice enough that you get to know the behavior of your camera, and you get to know the files it produces, and you get to know what the limits are when you try to edit those files later on. For the most part, what is most important is to try to capture as much dynamic range as possible, to capture as much detail as possible. And obviously, if you can get it right in the camera as much as possible, then that will minimize the amount of work that you have to do later on when you're editing. Now let's talk about focus. In my last video, I showed you how I use two different modes to recall custom settings, and I talked about a mode 1 and a mode 2, and how the mode 1 is sort of set up for say sort of generally shooting, say, mammals, like something like a fox like this, that might not be moving too fast. It might just be sort of walking slowly, or just running at a slow speed. And the shutter speed for that will generally, and of course it totally depends on the exposure and the situation, it might be sort of around 1/1000th of a second. It actually will typically be higher than that, at least maybe 1/1250. I have that also set up so that I have one of these focus areas that I can move around, and that I can change the size of. So it could be small, or it could be medium, or it could be large, and I do that to try to help the autofocus system to get things right. Now, if I switch to mode 2, I have a faster shutter speed set up, and I also, in this particular case right now, I have a different kind of focus mode that's being used. And so that's one of these tracking. I'm using a tracking autofocus in this particular case, and I'm using expand flexible spot. But the important point I want to make here is that I will just find whatever works, and that can only happen through obviously some experience, but also whatever the situation may be at the time. I'm going to try some things, and if I find that a certain kind of autofocus or a certain size autofocus works better, then that's what I will use. Now, what I mentioned in the last video was that as I'm going through my photography, when I'm out there in the field, if I'm switching back and forth between these two different modes of shooting, mode 1 and mode 2 for me, I will save back the settings of the exposure back to those modes so that I can instantly recall them. Now, I don't always do that, because there are times when I will just stay in one mode all the time. If I'm just out there, and let's just say I'm photographing foxes and I'm not going to see anything else, I'll just make my changes as I need to, and that's that. But if I, for some reason, need to be going back and forth between mode 1 and mode 2, I'll be making changes to the exposure. I'll save those settings back. So if I'm in mode 1, I'll make changes. I'll save the settings back to mode 1 and effectively update those settings. What I wanted to mention in this video is that I will also make changes to the focus sometimes. So sometimes I will try a different kind of focus behavior, or a different size of focus area, and I will also save those settings back as well. One of the important things that I want to let you know is that generally I really don't use tracking autofocus that much. I find it not reliable enough for most situations, and it's really a last resort for me. There are times, sometimes, if I'm shooting exceptionally fast subjects, for example, these puffins that I was photographing last year, and these pied kingfishers, those are two examples. In fact, they are the only two examples when I used tracking in the last 12 months. For the most part, I don't rely on the tracking, just because, as I mentioned in the last video, I don't really find it reliable enough. The other thing I wanted to mention is manual focus. I do think it's really important to be able to use the manual focus capability of your camera, because there will definitely be times when the autofocus system won't work. So in this particular case, if I switch into manual focus, you'll see the focus peaking appears here, and that's red in this particular case. But at least on the Sony cameras, you can set it up to be a different color. And then as I manually focus, now you'll see that I actually have things set up right now so that as soon as I started to manually focus, it actually jumped in and magnified the area. Now I also have the magnifier set up on one of my custom buttons here, so that I can change the level of magnification there for the manual focus view, and that can be a really handy thing. So I use that focus peaking, and then I use the magnifier to zoom in and out so that I can get more accurate with that manual focus. And there are definitely times, such as when the snow or the rain is falling right in front of the lens, or the subject is partially hidden by lots of foliage. Those are examples when the autofocus system may be having problems and you may have to go to manual focus. So that's it for this video. I hope you found this discussion helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to post below in the comments, or to jump on over to the Discord server where we can have a extended discussion. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.